back to another episode of Word Up with Danny Katz. It is my pleasure and honor to be joined today by author, counterculture philosopher Charles Eisenstein, who just launched his most recent book, The Coronation. Charles, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Danny. Happy to be here.
Great. I know you're just coming off of a pretty exciting weekend. How was Arcadia?
It was amazing. I just, since the pandemic, I've become all the more appreciative of in-person events. There's more of an entry threshold to hold an event, to travel. There's the uncertainty in travel, and that higher bar kind of raises the energy level and the expectations, and there's like just a common awareness that this is really special.
Yeah.
And so the events that I've been going to, including that one, have just been fantastic.
Great. Wonderful. I'm happy to hear it. I know that you have been, full disclosure, you've been on my radar for such a long time. I mentioned before we started recording, you and I were both writing for Reality Sandwich back in the day. I think you first hit my radar with Sacred Economics, and you were really, at the forefront of the conversation of how to give, sell, trade in a more integrous way. And then you jump back on my radar around the pandemic. And I noticed you were taking a really sort of centrist line. And then I noticed that kind of shifted for you. So I'm curious to know, how does it feel to be a pariah?
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm trying to think. Did I take a centrist line?
What would you call it?
I think it's more I was pretty strongly in the skeptical camp when it came to various COVID policies: lockdown, distancing, masking, vaccination.
Okay.
But my take on it was what I did not buy into or subscribe to is the idea that this is a war of good against evil, and that the cause of all this is a conscious conspiracy of evil individuals that are seeking deliberately and consciously to dominate the world for their malignant purposes. That is, in my view, a way too simplified. Not that there aren't conspiracies, corruption, lying, cover-ups, and all that. Yes, there are. But as far as the explanation for what happened, why it happened, it's a lot more complex than that. And so that refusal to subscribe to the militant conspiracy theories kind of earned me a reputation in the health freedom domain as kind of a wishy-washy, a suspect character, maybe controlled opposition and so forth. So but as far as the questions of the day, I wouldn't call myself a centrist in that regard. I'm not well, maybe the vaccines are not as bad as they say, but maybe they're no. I'm pretty at this point. I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt at first. I thought, maybe they'll work. Maybe the stuff about autoimmune enhancement and autobody enhancement and all that kind of stuff. I'm messing up my words. You know what I'm talking about. ADE, antibody dependent enhancement, and a non-sterilizing vaccine causing mutations and variants, and maybe the adverse events won't be that bad, and et cetera, et cetera. I was, willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, but events since then have proved, at least to my satisfaction, that they were a horrible mistake. So anyway, I would, it's good to come out and say it. And the thing is, this is another, when you ask a question like that, it's like it used to be, so I've heard, in Eastern Europe, or actually even when I lived in Taiwan in the 80s during martial law, where in order to have a conversation about something controversial, something heretical, you first like made a very, very subtle probe just to kind of gauge, is that person at all possibly a dissident? And if you get a positive response, then you go a little farther and a little farther, because you don't just come out and say it,
Right.
Because you could get arrested by the secret police.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you and I, neither of us are going to get arrested by the secret police, but I still have this caution. Okay, like, how far can I go? Like, are we going to get censored? Or am I going to get, attacked for being a granny killer and like all this stuff? And so, and the fact that I developed that habit was really significant to me. That's what showed me, wow, we are really on the way toward a totalitarian society. That is a habit of totalitarianism. So anyway, I know I said an awful lot for the first part of our conversation, so I will turn it back over to you. It
was perfect. I welcome it, and I'm really happy that you feel comfortable to speak freely as you totally are with me. It's interesting because, we've both been writers for a long time and kind of on these parallel pathways. And I've heard you say that you like sometimes temper what you write about or what you share so that you're not going to piss off your audience. So you probably say it more gracefully than that. And just kind of like you said, not necessarily centrist, but like being more delicate so that seemingly from my perspective that you were trying to expand your audience and not really create any more polarization than we're seeing now. And it seems like that shifted a little bit.
Yeah, right now people ask me what my ambition is, and I'm like, I'd like to shrink my audience, I say.
Ooh.
Because it wasn't so much of like not saying what I think. It was more a matter of, okay, I know I'm speaking to a pretty broad spectrum of people here. Like a lot of my audience, at least used to be progressives, leftists, who mostly cleaved toward the I believe in science position during the pandemic. And so I still have a lot of that legacy audience. Mm-hmm. And so I realized, I'm like, okay, I'm speaking to a lot of people. I can't take for granted that people are on board with what I'm saying here on COVID. So I have to preempt certain objections. I have to embed things in a deeper frame. I have to be really careful so that I don't immediately cause the people who are on the fence or maybe just having some doubts just to run away completely. Mm-hmm. But the disadvantage of that is that I never really get to the deep material. Like you got to preach to the choir sometimes too.
Right.
So that we can make beautiful music together. So there was that. And also, like at some points there was like it may have looked and felt to some people and even myself as cowardice. Like, okay, I don't dare say what I really think, but really that was reflecting an internal doubt that I had, because I really came to question, how do I know for sure that what I believe is true? Mm-hmm. Because there were so many conflicting narratives, and each one was stated with such certainty, including the conventional narrative. Mm-hmm. And these were, like doctors that I knew, people, saying, from emergency rooms, yeah, we are dealing with a real pandemic here. And, others saying ivermectin or whatever, hydroxychloroquine does not work. And then others, also doctors in clinical practice saying it does work, saying, or nurses saying, yeah, we're not really seeing it in this hospital, that like all these different narratives. And I'm like, okay. And then so the first essay I wrote was called The Coronation. Mm-hmm. And it was like, it went pretty viral. And I received a lot of criticism. And by contradicting what our health authorities are telling us, you are putting lives at risk. You are literally killing people. And I'm like, well, how do I know that that's not true? So I really, and from people I trusted too, mm-hmm. Who weren't just out to attack me. Mm-hmm. So I really went through a process of examining. I mean, it got actually to even an unhealthy point where I began questioning things that I've directly experienced. And I began to kind of gaslight myself. Like,
can you give me an example?
Yeah, like, like the stuff of the basic integrity of medicine, of our medical system, that has the most advanced therapies for things, and that, you know, dismisses and ridicules certain alternative modalities, and they're not tested, they're not proven. But like, I've physically like experienced and firsthand witnessed healings that were considered medically impossible, that were considered scientifically impossible,
right?
Many, many times. So am I like supposed to just take all those data points and throw them out? Well, I kind of started to do that, not consciously, not explicitly, but I removed those building blocks from my, or at least temporarily removed those building blocks from my edifice of knowledge. And maybe that was an important exercise, because I could see where what I could build from that. And it was not a very habitable construction. So anyway, for a while, like, I mean, I went for 8 months in 2020, early 2021, without writing about COVID at all, until I got really, really clear and solid within myself. And then I was able to, and that's what you're referring to, like at that point, I became more outspoken, especially about the totalitarian implications of running a society based on security, safety, health. I mean, that's how totalitarianism works. You need an enemy. You need a them to create the fascist us. And then you also always have an internal enemy that mirrors the external. So the external enemy is, you know, whatever, the Russians or the virus. The internal enemy are the collaborators, the anti-vaxxers. And then you have what began to develop during the pandemic. And that's what I wrote about most extensively.
And you have, from my perspective, I obviously haven't met you in person. I look forward to that day. But you strike me as very likable, right? As very humble and as a very like warm and caring person. Is this the first time you have been on the receiving end of mass negativity thrust your way?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's always, you know, negative comments and projections and stuff, but as far as like, you know, public denunciations and canceling and stuff like that, yeah, that was a new territory for me.
And what has that been like for you?
Well, it actually was, you know, really helpful in clarifying some of my unprocessed trauma and fears that I hadn't had to confront. The pandemic really was an initiation for me and for an awful lot of people. So for example, one of those, you know, when I published the essay, this was the one that really got me in trouble, called Mob Morality and the Unvaxxed. And when I hit that publish button, I had a sense of foreboding. I had a sense of terror, actually, because I knew what was going to happen.
Right.
And it like stirred up, probably it's like ancestral trauma. You know, my half of my family line is Jewish. My grandfather only escaped death at age 3 when he was hidden in a haystack from a murderous mob during a pogrom in Russia.
Whoa.
Like, you know, and I grew up hearing family stories of terror and starvation. The Polish branch of the family, they died in the Warsaw Ghetto, you know, under Hitler. Like, this is so, like, to volunteer to identify myself as a member of a heretical sect called, you know, anti-vaxxers. Like, that was really scary for me. And there's nothing like confronting your fear in order to integrate it and then transcend it. So, you know, it wasn't like the fear was ungrounded. You know, my own publisher, who I'd been with for 10 years, put on the front page of their website for a month a denunciation of me as an anti-Semite. Yeah.
They called you an anti-Semite?
Yeah.
What?
And other things. Yeah. I know. And like, yeah, because I understand the rationale, because I said in that essay that the same social forces that underlie witch hunts, pogroms, and the Holocaust are at work today.
Of course.
The forces of scapegoating, of dehumanization, of sacrificial dynamics, in the sense of the philosopher Rene Girard. I said, yeah, this is all happening. And so then, like, the anti-Semitism charge comes from, they said, dishonoring the memory of the victims of the Holocaust by using them to make a political point and drawing a false equivalency between the scientific attempt to protect the vulnerable with the mass murder of human beings. And so lots of people piled on, and like I got, like people, I was on programs and they reached out to me and said, Charles, we can't have you on our program anymore. We can't be associated with you. Like, I became radioactive, which was ironic because that was the whole point of the essay. Like, I was describing these dynamics where, like, it even goes back to school, to like 4th grade, where all of a sudden one kid's got cooties,
right?
And then no one will touch him.
Right.
It's the same thing, So anyway, yeah, that was part of my hazing ritual that ended up being a huge gift, because I'm way less afraid. I didn't even know those fears were operating.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So you mentioned now you're eager to thin your audience, and I'm curious to know, like, what is your agreement with your audience, and who now are you looking to connect with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm half joking. I think that the result of trying to shrink my audience might be that my audience grows, but it's really, I guess I'm just, I sometimes I hit this point of weariness and exasperation, where, like, a lot of the stuff I write is kind of, I point out the one of the patterns. This is pretty a roundabout answer to your question, but one of the patterns at work, like, I look at what are the deep social patterns that allowed this whole pandemic catastrophe to happen. Mm-hmm. What makes us vulnerable to totalitarianism? What makes us vulnerable to manipulation by psychopathic elites, if that's your narrative? Like, even if we accept that there are psychopathic elites, where do they get their power? It's not because they have bigger muscles. It's because they have the complicity of the public, mm-hmm. of millions and millions of decent people, even in the police forces. The police forces aren't riddled with psychopaths. The army isn't riddled with psychopaths. Like, where are they getting their power? So it's our acquiescence. So this is the question: what makes us so vulnerable to manipulation? Mm-hmm. And one of the deep patterns that I write about quite a lot is the pattern of diagnosing any problem as being caused by a villain. Mm-hmm. It's actually the same mentality as the germ theory of disease. Mm-hmm. Any illness, like, find the pathogen. Any social problem, find who we can blame for it. Mm-hmm. The immigrants, the Jews, the white supremacists, the Trumpers, Donald Trump, the bankers. Like, I mean, left and right do pretty much the same thing. Mm-hmm. So that pattern makes us vulnerable to anybody, any demagogue who says, there's the enemy in our midst. Like, we're primed to accept that narrative, and it makes us easy to manipulate. Mm-hmm. So I write about that a lot. And so it's a critique of the default habit of taking sides. Mm-hmm. And then people might respond with, but Charles, obviously those are the bad guys and these are the good guys. And by trying to understand the enemy, we're giving them a free pass, and we're letting them off the hook, and we're not holding them accountable. And like, and I'm like, no, I'm not saying that. Mm-hmm. But I get tired of explaining that every single time I write something. So I'm like, okay, maybe I just won't even bother to explain. And the people who get upset and don't understand that pacifism is not the same as acquiescence, and it's not the same as passivism, and that in fact, the more deeply you understand your enemy, the better you'll be able to fight, and you might not even have to fight. Like if you believe that your enemy is just demonic and just pure evil, you'll never understand them. And very rarely is anybody just pure evil. You know, you get to know these people. I was reading Naomi Wolf's excellent book, The Body is of Others. And she's describing like being in this, you know, super elite gathering, you know, and everybody has their yacht, you know, and their private jet. And they're talking about the Syriza government in Greece that's trying to resist the austerity measures, and like everybody's all very sophisticated, you know, and talking about art and the opera and whatever, and like these are just, you know, what these hominids do in that particular setting that they're in. They're not any more evil than, you know, a bunch of guys at the football game, you know. This is just what human beings do, what we are. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to end up jousting against windmills. Like you're going to create enemies in the image of your own fear and perception. And the result is endless war. So like, I guess, I don't know, rather than like preempt all of the possible objections every time. And that's just a superficial level. I like to go really, really deep into like the psychology, into the spirituality, like all the way to the bottom.
Yeah.
Without having to like apologize for it, you know, without having to say, okay, it's okay to, you know, because then people are like criticizing me for, Charles used to be like so engaged with actual practical issues, and now there's all this, you know, new age spiritual mumbo jumbo. And like, okay, so here's another, am I talking too much?
Not at all.
Okay, so here's another thing, like another of my internal patterns that comes up in all of this is like childhood stuff about trying to keep everybody happy, trying to keep mom happy, and trying to keep dad happy at the same time, and losing myself. So to me, like shrinking my audience really is about just not caring about that anymore. Yeah.
That's huge. I'm happy for you to be there and to have integrated that piece. Because as writers, it's like we're out there with our perspectives, our unintegrated traumas are informing those. So when we're shifting how we write, what we're writing about, you know, the audience might be annoyed, but that's, you know, that's reflecting our growth process, our integration process, you know, letting go of needing to be liked, of pleasing everyone.
Yeah. But there's another part too. It's not just like wanting to be liked. It's also this impulse of kindness, you know, because like if I say something, like recently I wrote about and gave some stories that people shared with me about how it felt to be unvaccinated and to be ostracized from groups that we'd been part of for a long time. Like one woman wrote, you know, she's like, I've been kicked out of my knitting circle. I've been kicked out of my ukulele circle. I can't go to the soccer game. I can't, like all these, you know, our church has expelled us. It was supposed to be a tolerant of diversity church. We can't go anymore. Like she listed like 20 different things, you know? And so I wrote a little bit about the social dynamics of that.
Yeah.
But then the people who had been vaccinated, they read it as, oh, Charles is blaming us. But, you know, and they feel like, so now I wasn't actually blaming them, but it's not, I'm not looking for an excuse, okay? I'm looking to actually deliver something good to the world through my writing. So how it's received is really important, much more important than did I actually say that? It's how it's received. And I don't want to deepen the division by making people, by feeding the story that of us versus them, by giving them the experience of being attacked. So it's not so simple, as letting go of being liked and approved of. It's also just an awareness of who I'm speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's an easy solution to this dilemma. And as a writer, you probably understand what I'm talking about. Like, who is my audience? And by speaking to them, who am I leaving out? And what's the overall impact?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the main pieces I got when you were talking about, people wanting to have a demon to blame, a Trump, an anti-vaxxer, or this or that, is that, well, then we're dodging self-responsibility. So if we're victims and it's everyone else's fault, then we're never going to take whatever responsibility is necessary for us to shift and course correct. I've been tracking what's going on right now for 22 years, and I've been trying my best to stop it. When it happened, I wasn't surprised. But for me, it was like, well, where have I dropped the ball? Like, where is my apathy or, my disinterest in the political process contributing to this? So I feel the same about my audience, where it's like, I trust my audience to be self-responsible and to take responsibility for their triggers, and to trust that I'm coming from a place of purity and good intention. Of course, that always takes tweaking. But I think if I'm constantly second guessing my audience's ability to be triggered, then I'm doing them a disservice.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of where I'm coming to. I just can't caretake everybody's triggers,
No, and I think it's, I think that kind of, from my perspective, it's a type of codependence that comes from kindness and comes from compassion. But I think that's part of the reason why we're at the place that we are today, is because we don't trust one another to have the tools to lose at tag, to not be picked for dodgeball, all these things that have made us so much softer and more sensitive. So, yeah, I feel like it's just, at this point, if anyone thinks that you're not kind-hearted and that you're trying to hurt people, then they have work to do on themselves.
Yeah. And I'm not so concerned about whether people think that I'm kind-hearted or I'm trying to hurt people. It's more like, what's the actual impact that my words are having on society? And like, sometimes, I'm really questioning whether my best service is to continue writing expository prose. Like, maybe, I've been doing a little more work with story, with other ways of using the power of word, besides besides making an argument.
Yeah, this is something I'm a journalist. That's my background, but these days I'm demonized as what some people would call conspiracy theorists. And I know that the history of that word, so I don't necessarily cozy up to it. But, I've spoken to people in the community about it, of like, I don't know how effective we're going to be when it's like, an angry person yelling at the camera and speaking in like sort of didactic, instructive languaging, versus being more entertaining, more metaphorical, using more poetry and fiction to deliver the message, kind of like medicine in, some peanut butter or something.
Yeah, right. And ultimately, one of my favorite sayings is, you can't reason somebody out of a belief that they didn't reason themselves into to begin with.
Oh, I like that.
So our beliefs are not isolated intellectual constructs.
Mm-hmm.
They're part of a state of being.
Mm-hmm.
They are like the top layer of a state of being. And I know this because I've seen time and again, when somebody has an impactful experience that changes who they are, then their beliefs quickly and easily change around that. So as agents of change, maybe it's more important, maybe we can just trust that whatever healing that we embody, whatever vibration that we embody, that will be a lot more attractive than the logical arguments we can make and the evidence that we can cite. Because we've all had the experience of the futility of logic and evidence in changing anybody's mind. Yeah. Something else has to change. And maybe the change, the vehicle of change, like, is when like we really pay attention to somebody and see them with eyes of love and peace, and they pick up on that somehow, and they're a little bit less resistant. And maybe then you do say a couple things about what you think about something, and it lands in a way that it ordinarily wouldn't. There's not as much resistance. And they're like, whatever this guy's on, I want some of that, you know? So I think that, you know, there's people have an aversion to characters like David Icke, and a lot of the well-known conspiracy theorists. Like, there's an energy there of, I mean, there's a mix, but there's an energy of despair, because that creeps in, because if you really believe that the hands is under the world is in the hands of a super powerful, invisible elite, then what hope is there for the world if they're in control of the media, of the money system, of everything? And so that despair is not attractive to people. Whereas, oh, it's attractive to some. It's actually kind of attractive to me. There's part of me that feels a perverse comfort in my irredeemable victimhood. But more and more, I'm attracted to the new story of how change happens, what's possible, and who I am. That requires data points that do not fit that narrative, that show that reality is not a contest of force versus force, that miraculous synchronicities can happen in correspondence with a release of control on my part. And therefore that we are powerful far beyond what the conspiracy narrative says we are. And I don't want to draw like too hard a distinction here, because usually the conspiracy, when I say conspiracy narrative, I'm talking about the capital C conspiracy, okay? Because as I said before, I think there are all kinds of conspiracies and cover-ups going on, and corruption in the pharmaceutical industry and the regulatory agencies, all that, okay? But the big C conspiracy, usually there's an element of that narrative that is about awakening. They're afraid of us awakening to our true power. And so the paradox is that the capital C conspiracy isn't actually powerful. But there is some kind of mixed message in the narrative that gives them power that they don't have. And that radiates out and I think turns people off. I just spent some time with Zach Bush. It seems like I know you have like some comebacks here, but I just spent some time with Zach Bush. He's become a dear friend, and he's like, I mean, he's fully aware of all of these narratives, but he basically decides that he is not living in that reality. He's living in the reality where the people in positions of power want to change, and it's maybe requires courage for them to do so, and overcoming a lot of institutional inertia and going against what their peer group says or seems to think, but they really secretly want to, and he's going to give them an opportunity to do that. And he's like, yeah, we've already won. Everything that needs to happen for this world transforming movement to blossom is already done. The work is already done, and it's happening. And that belief corresponds to a state of being that's the result of his personal journey, I guess, and the whatever blessings he's received in his life. And so that's the level that when I'm writing about, the COVID politics or the social dynamics of it, the psychological, sometimes I have the feeling that I'm not getting down to this level, because I just have to clear away too much smoke, and I'm like, I want to talk about this level. And maybe that means speaking to a smaller audience. Because a lot of people are going to have already turned this conversation off.
My audience knows what they're in for.
Okay.
It's interesting because I find David Icke, who I've been tracking, since probably the 90s. I find him very hopeful, and I find his message to be very positive and uplifting. But again, I've been in this conspiracy conversation for quite a long time as a journalist, which is why it gets extra loaded for me, where it's like, I see so many people saying that these things are impossible because of the limits of their own imagination, which I find is so odd, where it's like, I can't imagine all these media companies are in collusion. And it's like, that's not debunking. Like, just because your imagination remains contracted doesn't mean that it's not true. And I find it interesting, like how many people have done no actual research into these things, but definitively declare that they're not true just because the inside of their brain rejects it.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. Like, I like David Icke. Like, I'm not, trying to paint him as like anything bad. And I do think he has a note of positivity, and he appeals to a lot of people. And there's also, like, I can understand why some people are repelled by him as well. Like, very, very good versus evil in his worldview, and for me, that makes me uneasy, because there's always a part of myself that wonders, maybe I'm one of the evil ones. And like, have you ever on like plant medicine or in meditation, have you ever had that like humiliating realization that, oh my God, everything that I've ever done is from ego, or like 99.9% of it. And if we're going to go around condemning people, like, there's the secret suspicion that maybe actually I'm in that group and I just put on a better show. And someday the mob will turn on me. Like, this is one of the chief insecurities of the human psyche, because this experience of the mob turning on you has been witnessed throughout history, like, and before history. Like, this is one of our deepest instincts, is to figure out who's the popular crowd and who they're going to turn on, and make sure that you're not in that subgroup that's going to get victimized. Like, so that I think that's one of the deepest explanations for the social catastrophe that has arisen in response to COVID, like that pattern. And so, while I think that the conspiracy universe is revealing a lot of things that, like you say, that people are just unwilling to look at because they break their worldview. Like, they're like the glitch in the matrix. They don't fit in to their matrix of belief, so they just have to discard them. Because if that were true, then everything I know would be false. Like, even something as simple as if John F. Kennedy was killed with a CIA-backed conspiracy, like, what does that mean about our government today? What does that mean about history? What is that? Like, you can't even take that data point in. And I think that there's an awful lot of those data points. Like, I'm not writing off David Icke or anything. That said, like, not all the conspiracies can be true. And most of them speak with the same vibration of certainty, whether it is, flat Earth or hollow Earth, or the ones that think that there's 500 years of history that has been added, and that you're familiar with all these, right?
Of course, Tartaria.
Yeah, and they contradict each other. Like, they can't all be true.
Why can't they, though? I mean, some people are working in ERs and saying the pandemic's super real, everyone's dying, and then another doctor saying it's not at all. So we're obviously living in a multidimensional, weird world with divergent timelines.
Right. Okay. So if you're right, so if we're going to go to questioning objective reality, and living in a multiverse, yeah, I'm totally with you. And in fact, that's where I went in. I wrote an essay called "The Conspiracy Myth."
I love that one.
Yeah, that kind of goes into that territory. Like calling something a myth doesn't mean it's false.
Right.
Kind of the opposite, actually. Myths carry a truth beyond their factual content. And I think there's a deep truth in even the big C conspiracy theory, which is basically that an unfriendly power is orchestrating the tragic events of this world, and that the people we see as our leaders are but puppets of this power. Like, there's a deep truth in that. Personally, I don't think that the power is best understood as being a small coterie of, shadowy billionaires and reptilian ETs. But I'm not saying that that's not true either. Like, even that myth also carries truth, whether or not it's factually true. And whatever fact means, I mean, that's a whole can of worms too. But like, it carries a truth regardless of its factual content, in that there is something alien to human well-being about this, and even reptilian in a way, and inhuman. It's inhuman. It is like in deep contradiction to our fundamental humanity. So that truth can take the form of a myth in our conventional sense of something that's not actually true. But if you believe that reality is constructed of myth, not of particles, not of facts, but of myths, then you could have like some people looking at Hillary Clinton and she shapeshifts into a reptilian and back again, and somebody else looking at the same time and not seeing that. And the Cartesian mind wants to say, well, one of them has to be true and one has to be the imagination. But what if they're simply living in two alternate realities? Yeah.
And even if we're talking about like 3D rationalist particle reality, everything is still, wave or particle? Like, even physical reality is not constant or consistent. It depends on our lens of perception.
Right.
So I think, and for me, it's a matter of just like how far we develop our consciousness and how much we unravel, because I'm sure the more that we work on ourselves, meditate, do plant medicine, our ideas of reality get fuzzier and fuzzier, right? Like, it all starts to get really thin. So even with flat earth, because I know you've brought it up before, and these days it's kind of the script. Like, if someone's on a podcast and they acknowledge one conspiracy, then they have to deride flat earthers at the same time, right? It goes without saying.
You make fun of the more weird kids so that you don't fall into,
Exactly.
Right.
But then we go into like, okay, let's pretend I didn't know everything I know about NASA, which I do because I do my research, but let's take that off the table and assume NASA's on the up and up. We're still limited by our third dimensional monkey minds and our five senses. So what appears to be round from this perspective very well might not be, with more faculties and other dimensional perception. So I think there's just something to this willingness to say, I don't know, that I think would be so liberating for humanity, even just as an intellectual exercise, to not make fun of flat earthers, but in the same way of like, well, what is their perspective? Like, okay, break it down for me. How could the earth be flat, and avail ourselves to the fact that we might not know everything about everything?